A gas station parking lot at dusk, cold wind cutting across the pavement. An older man sat against the wall near the ice machine, worn layers, a cardboard sign propped against his knee. Marisol Vega, 34, in a diner uniform under a thin jacket, stopped mid-stride on her way to her car. Sir, have you eaten today? Ma'am, you don't need to worry about me. I'm not asking because I have to. I'm asking because it's cold out here. You look like you're running on empty yourself. Everybody's running on empty. Doesn't mean we stop looking out for each other. She pressed a folded $20 bill into his hand, the last bill in her wallet. He looked down at it, then up at her face, something shifting behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the money. What's your name? Doesn't matter. Stay warm tonight. She was gone before he could say anything else. He sat there a long moment, staring at the 20 in his hand, like it weighed more than it should. She gave away the last $20 in her wallet that night, money she needed for her own daughter's medicine, to a stranger she never expected to see again, on a corner where 3 other cars had already driven past him without slowing down. She didn't ask his name. She didn't want anything back. What she had no way of knowing was that this was not the last time she'd see that man's face. And when he came looking for her 2 weeks later, nothing about her life would ever look quite the same again. Marisol Vega gave away the last $20 in her wallet on a Tuesday night in November, money she needed for her own daughter's medicine, to a stranger she never expected to see again. She had no way of knowing that within 2 weeks, that same man would be standing at her front door, or that he'd bring something with him that would explain exactly why he'd been sitting against that gas station wall in the first place. So, here's what you need to be asking. Who was that man, really? Why does a stranger who looked like he had nothing suddenly have the means to track down a diner waitress across town? And when he finally knocks on her door, what will he reveal about the actual price she paid to help him that night, on the one day she genuinely couldn't afford to lose anything at all? Marisol Vega was 34 years old and had been running on some version of empty for about 6 years straight, ever since her daughter Camila was born with a heart murmur that had, over time, settled into something the specialists called manageable but never called cured. Manageable meant medication, twice daily, a name Marisol could pronounce perfectly by now, and a copay that had climbed twice in the last year alone. Cured was a word nobody had used with her since Camila was 2. She remembered the night Camila was born, more clearly than she remembered most of the 6 years since. A cardiologist, with a kind but careful face, explaining a murmur that wasn't an emergency, exactly, but wasn't nothing either, and the particular sensation of holding a 2-day-old infant while learning a vocabulary she'd never expected to need. She'd promised herself in that hospital room that Camila would never once feel like a burden for needing more than other kids needed, and she'd spent 6 years quietly keeping that promise, at the cost of almost everything else in her own life. She worked the lunch and dinner shift at a diner called The Wagon Wheel on the edge of town, and 3 mornings a week she cleaned offices in a business park before anyone else arrived. Because the math of one job had stopped working out, sometime around Camila's 4th birthday, her closest friend at the diner, a waitress named Bianca, who'd worked the counter beside her for 3 years, was usually the only person who knew when Marisol was running on fumes, mostly because Bianca was the one who quietly covered her tables on the mornings Camila had an appointment nobody else needed to know about. "You're going to run yourself into the ground for that girl," Bianca told her more than once, not as a criticism, just as an observation offered by someone who watched it happening up close. Her husband, Camila's father, had left when Camila was 18 months old. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way some men leave when a hard situation asks more of them than they'd planned on giving. Marisol didn't spend much time thinking about him anymore. She didn't have the spare hours for it. Her mother, Rosa, lived 4 hours south and called every Sunday without fail, a widow herself now, retired from 30 years of factory work with a pension that covered her own bills and not much beyond them, which meant the calls were long on love and short on anything more material than that. Rosa had offered, more than once, to have Marisol and Camila move in with her, and Marisol had turned it down every time, partly out of pride, and partly because Camila's specialists were here, and starting over somewhere new felt like a risk she couldn't afford to take with her daughter's heart. The office cleaning mornings ran from 5 to 7, 3 floors of a business park that smelled like stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner, empty except for Marisol and a security guard named Doug, who nodded at her every morning without ever quite learning her name. She liked those mornings more than she would have expected to. Oddly, something about the quiet, the predictability of it, wiping down the same desks in the same order, gave her 45 uninterrupted minutes most days to let her mind wander toward recipes instead of bills, which was as close to a vacation as her schedule currently allowed. She and Camila lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, in a building owned by a landlord named Mr. Petrakis, who was not unkind exactly, but who also was not in the business of extending grace past the 5th of the month. Marisol had been late twice this year already, and the second time he'd told her, not unkindly, but not gently either, that a third time meant he'd have to start the paperwork, business being business. What almost nobody at the wagon wheel knew about Marisol Vega was the second notebook she kept in her apron pocket, separate from the one she used for order tickets, a small spiral pad filled with her own recipes, dishes she'd grown up watching her grandmother make in a kitchen 3 states south of here, adapted and refined over years of tasting and retasting on her one night off a week. Her grandmother had run a small, unofficial kitchen out of her own home for decades, feeding half the block on holidays whether or not anyone could pay her back for it, and Marisol had absorbed both the recipes and the instinct behind them without ever once being formally taught either. She'd never gone to culinary school. She'd never had the money or the time to consider it seriously. But she cooked the way some people paint or write, the way a thing lives in you whether or not the world around you has made any room for it yet. The pharmacy counter that Tuesday had gone the way it usually went lately. The pharmacist, a tired but kind woman named Mrs. Okafor, who'd rung Marisol up enough times by now to recognize the particular expression that crossed her face at the register, sliding the receipt across with a small, apologetic wince. "It went up again, hun. I'm sorry. Insurance changed something on their end, not us." Marisol had nodded, paid it, and done the math in her head the whole walk back to her car. Groceries would have to stretch thinner. The electric bill might need to wait a few extra days past its due date, but Camila's medication was never, under any circumstance, the thing that waited. That Tuesday in November, Marisol had picked up Camila's prescription refill on her way home from the lunch shift, the co-pay higher again, and had exactly one $20 bill left in her wallet after handing it over, money that was supposed to stretch across groceries until Friday's paycheck. She was tired in the specific, bone-deep way that comes from being tired for 6 years running rather than one bad week, and she was thinking about none of that particularly hard when she pulled into the gas station to fill up before her evening shift and saw a man sitting against the wall near the ice machine, wearing too many layers for the season and none of them warm enough. Marisol almost kept walking. She had exactly one $20 bill and a refrigerator that needed more in it than her last paycheck had left room for. And every practical calculation available to her said, keep moving. This isn't your problem to solve tonight. She'd watched, in the 2 minutes before she pulled into the pump, 3 other cars pass through that same gas station lot. one driver glancing toward the man against the wall and looking away fast, one couple stepping wide around him on their way to the door without any acknowledgement at all, one teenager on a skateboard rolling straight past close enough to nearly clip his outstretched legs without appearing to notice him as a person at all. She'd grown up watching her grandmother feed anyone who showed up at the back door hungry, a habit passed down without ever being explained in words, and something about the particular way this man kept his eyes down, like he'd already gotten used to nobody looking back, made her stop anyway. She crouched down near him, close enough to talk without making a show of it. "Sir, have you eaten today?" He didn't quite meet her eyes at first. "Ma'am, you don't need to worry about me. I'm not asking because I have to," she said. "I'm asking because it's cold out here." "You look like you're running on empty yourself," he said. And there was something oddly precise in the observation, not the vague kindness of a stranger, but the specific attention of someone actually looking. Marisol let out a tired half-laugh. "Everybody's running on empty. Doesn't mean we stop looking out for each other." She opened her wallet, pulled out the one folded bill inside it, and pressed it into his hand before she could talk herself out of it. She thought, briefly and without much drama, about the grocery list she'd have to shorten because of it, and decided the math would work itself out, the way it always somehow did. He looked down at the 20 for a long moment, then back up at her face, and something moved behind his eyes that had very little to do with the money itself. "What's your name?" he asked. "Doesn't matter," she said, already straightening up, already thinking about the gas she still needed to pump, and the shift she was going to be late for if she didn't hurry. "Stay warm tonight." She was back in her car and pulling out of the lot before he'd said anything else, and she didn't think about the exchange again that night, not because it hadn't mattered to her, but because giving away $20 to a stranger who needed it more than she did wasn't the kind of thing Marisol Vega considered remarkable. It was just Tuesday. She clocked in 11 minutes late to her dinner shift, told Bianca a half-true story about traffic, and spent the rest of the night refilling coffee cups and carrying plates. The $20, and the man at the gas station already filed away in the part of her mind reserved for things that happened and then simply stopped happening. The man sat against that gas station wall for a long time after she drove away, the $20 bill still folded in his palm, staring after her car long after its taillights had disappeared around the corner. Something about the way she'd asked, the way she hadn't waited around for thanks, seemed to settle something in him that had been unsettled for longer than one Tuesday night could account for. The man had less to go on than he'd like. No name. A diner uniform, gray with a faded logo he didn't recognize. A car he'd only half seen pulling out of the lot. He had his assistant, a sharp, discreet woman named Renata, start calling diners within a 15-mile radius of that gas station, describing a uniform color and a logo shape to managers who mostly had no idea what she was talking about. It took 4 days. A diner called the Wagon Wheel matched the description on the third call, and the manager, a gruff, no-nonsense man named Ollie, confirmed that yes, that sounded exactly like Marisol, who worked lunch and dinner most days and had a reputation, among staff, for feeding stray dogs and questionable-looking customers alike on her own dime more often than the register technically allowed. "She giving away restaurant food or her own money?" Renata asked, carefully. "Both knowing her," Ollie said. "Why, she in some kind of trouble?" "No," Renata said. "Someone would just like to thank her properly." Her employer had Renata pull together, quietly and respectfully, the basic shape of Marisol's situation before he ever showed up anywhere near her, not to invade her privacy for its own sake, but because he'd decided, whatever else this turned into, that showing up empty-handed with only gratitude and no actual help would be its own kind of hollow gesture. What Renata found took the easy warmth out of the moment and replaced it with something heavier. A 6-year-old daughter with a heart condition requiring daily medication, a landlord's second warning about late rent, 2 jobs stacked on top of each other just to keep both of those facts survivable. She gave away her last $20, Renata said quietly, setting the folder on his desk, the same day she paid a pharmacy copay that had gone up for the second time this year. He sat with that fact longer than he sat with most numbers that crossed his desk in an average week. He asked Renata to hold the folder a few extra days before arranging any visit at all. He wanted to think carefully about how to approach a woman who was, by every measure in that folder, already stretched to the edge of what she could carry. And the last thing he wanted was to add the stress of a stranger's sudden interest in her life, on top of everything else she was already managing. "Ease into it," he told Renata. "Let her see my actual face first, without anything else on the table yet. Let her decide I'm not dangerous before she has to decide anything else." On a Saturday afternoon 2 weeks later, Marisol answered a knock at her apartment door, expecting the building's maintenance man about a leaking faucet, and instead found a clean-shaven man in an unremarkable coat standing in the hallway, a woman with a tablet a step behind him. Narrator voice only, same as the rest of the script from here forward, no character clips needed for this scene, still images carry it. A narrow apartment hallway, above a laundromat. Marisol stood in her doorway, Camila peeking out from behind her leg. Desmond Ashcroft, clean-shaven now, stood with Renata a step behind him. "Can I help you?" Marisol asked. "I hope so," he said. "Actually, I think it might be the other way around. I'm sorry. Do I know you? We met at a gas station about 2 weeks ago. You asked if I'd eaten that day." Her expression shifted, recognition, then a flicker of embarrassment. "You look different." "I clean up all right, it turns out," he said. "My name is Desmond Ashcroft. I wasn't lying to you that night exactly. I just wasn't telling you the whole truth either. I don't understand. I spend 1 week a year finding out who still stops for a stranger who looks like they've got nothing. Most people don't. You did. And when I found out what it actually cost you to do that—" "You don't need to do anything," Marisol said. "I didn't help you for a reward." "I know you didn't," he said. "That's exactly why I'm here." Camila peeked out further, curious rather than shy. "Are you the man from the story Mommy told me, the cold one?" Ashcroft crouched slightly to her level, gentle. "I might be. Your mom kept me warm that night. Did she tell you that part?" "She said, everybody deserves somebody to stop for them," Camila said. Something in his expression softened further. "She's right about that." Marisol looked down at her daughter, then back at Ashcroft, uncertain, but no longer quite as guarded. Marisol didn't invite them in that day, not out of rudeness, but because 11 years of hard math had taught her to be careful of anything that arrived sounding too good, too fast, too easy. She'd seen enough daytime television segments about scams targeting exhausted single mothers to know exactly how this could go wrong, and she kept one hand lightly on Camila's shoulder the entire conversation, angling her own body slightly between her daughter and the 2 strangers, without ever quite deciding to do it consciously. She asked for a few days to think, and Ashcroft, to Renata's mild surprise, agreed without pushing, leaving only a card with a direct number and no pressure attached to it. It took Marisol 4 days, 2 long conversations with Ollie at the diner who vouched, cautiously, for what he'd found online about Ashcroft Dynamics. A real company, real news coverage, real employees who spoke well of him in the handful of interviews Ollie tracked down, and 1 longer conversation with her own mother over the phone, who listened to the whole story twice through before saying, simply, "Baby, you already did the kind thing. If this is real, Let the universe do its part too. It was that last conversation, more than either of the others, that finally moved Marisol to pick up the phone and call the number back. If you've ever had someone offer you something that felt too large to trust on the first knock at the door, you understand exactly why Marisol Vega waited those 4 days before she let herself believe any of it was real. What Ollie's research turned up, and what Ashcroft filled in himself over that first real conversation, was a story neither Marisol nor anyone watching that gas station encounter could have guessed. 22 years earlier, Desmond Ashcroft had been genuinely, entirely homeless, not for a week of research, but for 2 years, after a failed business partnership and a breakdown that cost him his marriage, his apartment, and most of what he'd believed about himself. The partnership had collapsed after a co-founder he trusted quietly emptied their shared accounts and disappeared to another country, leaving Ashcroft holding debts he hadn't personally incurred and a reputation in his small industry that made every subsequent job interview feel like walking into a room where everyone already knew the ending of his story before he'd said a word. He slept in a converted van until the van got repossessed, then on benches, then in a shelter, when the weather turned dangerous enough to make pride feel like a luxury he couldn't afford. During the worst stretch of it, he ate most nights at a small 24-hour diner off Route 9, run by a woman named Pearl Higgins, who fed him for free more often than she billed him, who never once made him feel like a charity case while she was doing it, and who told him one thing, repeated often enough over 18 months, that he could still recite it word for word 2 decades later: the world's going to tell you what you are, based on what you've got. Don't you dare believe it before you've had a chance to prove otherwise. Pearl kept a stool at the end of her counter that she called, without much ceremony, the thinking seat, and let Ashcroft sit there for hours some nights, doing nothing but nursing 1 cup of coffee and slowly rebuilding the version of himself that had gone missing somewhere in the collapse. Pearl died of a stroke the year after Ashcroft got back on his feet, before he'd earned enough to properly thank her, a fact that sat in him for the rest of his life, like an unpaid debt he'd never get the chance to settle directly. He rebuilt slowly, a warehouse job first, then a small logistics software company built out of a spare bedroom, then a company that solved a genuinely hard problem for a genuinely large industry, tracking freight in a way nobody else had quite managed to make reliable at scale. By his late 40s, Ashcroft Dynamics was worth more than he'd ever imagined a business could be worth, and Desmond Ashcroft had become the kind of wealthy that made his name recognizable well outside the industries he actually worked in. He never stopped keeping a version of Pearl's thinking seat in his own life, a plain stool in the corner of his office that his executive team had long since stopped asking about, along with the 7 days every November when he simply vanished from every calendar invite without explanation. That was, Ashcroft explained to Marisol once she'd finally agreed to sit down with him properly, exactly what those 7 days were for. He'd started the practice 11 years earlier, quietly, telling no one at the company why he disappeared every November, dressing down, unshaven, sitting in the specific kinds of places where people who have nothing get treated like they're not fully present in a room. It wasn't a stunt. He never filmed it, never publicized it while it was happening, never used it for a headline. It was closer to a private audit of the world, an attempt to find out, every year, whether the specific thing Pearl Higgins had given him for free still existed in enough people to be worth still believing in. Most years, the honest answer was, rarely, and usually only from people who had very little themselves. Servers who slipped him a to-go box, a teenager who gave him half a sandwich without breaking stride. Once, memorably, a police officer who bought him a coffee instead of moving him along. But most people, the vast majority, simply didn't see him at all, walked past with the specific, practiced blindness people develop toward anyone they've decided isn't fully a person that day. In 11 years, only 3 people before Marisol had ever done something that met the bar Ashcroft privately set for the experiment. Not just kindness, but kindness that cost the giver something real, offered without any expectation of being seen doing it. The clearest of those 3, he told her, had happened 7 years earlier in a different state entirely. A night shift nurse named Deborah, coming off a double, who'd found him sitting outside a hospital's emergency entrance in the rain and simply sat down on the wet curb beside him, rather than standing over him the way most people did when they stopped at all. She'd shared half of a sandwich she'd packed for her own break, stayed with him for 20 minutes, talking about nothing in particular, and left without ever asking his name. Marisol sat with all of it for a long moment once he'd finished, turning her own coffee cup slowly on the table. "So, the whole thing at the gas station," she said, "that was never really about you needing help at all." "No," he admitted. "It was about finding out if anyone still would, when it looked like there was nothing in it for them. You were the 4th person in 11 years who did." Ashcroft hadn't come to that meeting alone, and he hadn't come with an envelope. He'd brought Renata a folder, and the same unhurried, itemized honesty he'd used with every family in every year of this experiment that had actually panned out. Once he'd finished explaining himself, he moved on to the reason Renata's folder was still sitting closed on the table between them. He covered Camila's medical costs first, not just the current prescriptions, but a standing arrangement with a pediatric cardiology practice 2 hours away that Marisol had never been able to afford the consult fees to even visit, plus a dedicated fund that would follow Camila through every appointment, every medication adjustment, for as long as she needed it. Renata slid across a letter from the practice itself, already confirming an intake appointment for the following Tuesday, as though the decision had been made before Marisol had even said yes to any of it. He paid off the back rent that had put her on Mr. Petrakis's second warning list, and beyond that, quietly purchased the small building she lived in outright, restructuring her lease so that rent increases could never again be the reason she and Camila lost their home. Mr. Petrakis, informed of the sale by his own lawyer, rather than by Marisol, called her 2 days later, sounding considerably warmer than he had in 3 years of collecting her rent, which struck Marisol as almost funnier than it was irritating. He asked, gently, about the second notebook in her apron pocket. Ollie, it turned out, had mentioned it without thinking much of it, and Ashcroft had thought about it a great deal since, and offered to fund a small storefront of her own, no strings beyond the ones she chose to attach herself, if that was a dream she still wanted. Marisol sat very still for a long moment after that particular offer, longer than she'd sat still for any of the others, because the medical fund and the rent were about surviving, and this one was about something she'd stopped letting herself want out loud years ago. "I stopped telling people about the notebook a long time ago," she admitted, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. "Felt like a good way to disappoint myself on a schedule. Easier to just cook for Camila and leave it at that." "You don't have to say yes today," Ashcroft said. "The offer doesn't expire. I'd rather you take a month deciding you actually want it than say yes right now, just because the moment feels big." She didn't need the month. She said yes 11 days later, over the phone, her voice steadier than she expected it to be. Marisol cried at the kitchen table for the first time in longer than she could remember. Not the exhausted private crying she sometimes did after Camila was asleep, but something that felt, oddly, like relief finally arriving after being expected for years. "Why me?" she asked, once she trusted her voice again. "Plenty of people probably would have helped you if they'd known who you were. That's exactly the point, Ashcroft said. You didn't know. Most people, when they don't know, don't stop at all. You did. On a night you genuinely couldn't afford to lose that $20. Marisol asked quietly. About the other two he hadn't mentioned yet. Deborah the nurse. She now knew. But who else? Ashcroft told her honestly. A teenage boy who'd handed over half a sandwich without breaking his walking pace and later got a full college fund he hadn't asked for. A retired mechanic who'd let him sit in a warm garage for an afternoon and repaired Ashcroft's rented car for free, refusing payment until Ashcroft had simply left the money under a toolbox and driven off. 3 names before hers now. 3 quiet gestures. 3 lives changed in 3 different corners of the country. None of them ever publicized. None of them ever turned into a headline Ashcroft could take credit for. I don't do this to be thanked, he told her. I do it because Pearl Higgins fed a broke, humiliated man for 18 months, and never once let me feel like I owed her for it. I couldn't pay her back before she died. This is the closest I've ever found to settling that account. The following Tuesday, the intake appointment Renata had arranged came first, before any of the rest of it had fully sunk in. Marisol sat in a waiting room 2 hours from home that looked nothing like the rushed clinic visits she'd grown used to, and a pediatric cardiologist named Dr. Whitfield spent 40 unhurried minutes with Camila, running tests nobody had ever had the time or the budget to run before sitting down with Marisol afterward to explain, in the kind of detail she'd been quietly hungry for since Camila was 2 days old, exactly what manageable meant, what it didn't mean, and what signs would actually warrant concern, rather than the vague, anxious guessing Marisol had been doing alone for 6 years. She cried in the parking garage afterward, not from bad news, but from the specific relief of finally being able to ask every question she'd never had the appointment time to ask before. A year later, the corner table, Marisol's own small restaurant, named for the corner booth at the wagon wheel where she used to scribble recipes on her break, open 2 blocks from the apartment she and Camila still lived in, now free of any landlord's second warnings for good. Ollie came to the opening in his one good shirt and told anyone who'd listen that he'd trained her, which was true enough that Marisol let him have it. Bianca left the wagon wheel 3 weeks later to come work the front of house, a decision she made, she said, before Marisol had even finished asking. The menu was small and entirely her grandmother's, translated as faithfully as memory, and 6 years of practice allowed, with one addition Marisol insisted on from the opening day: a single stool in the corner near the kitchen pass, unofficial, unmarked, that any customer having a hard week was welcome to sit at for as long as they liked. No obligation to order anything at all. She never explained the stool to most people who asked about it. The ones who needed the explanation usually didn't need to hear it out loud. Camila's heart condition remained manageable, the same word it had always been, except now manageable came with quarterly visits to a specialist, 2 hours away, and medication that never once caused a moment of hesitation at the pharmacy counter. She was 7 now, and she liked to sit on a stool in the restaurant's kitchen after school, helping in the specific way 6- and 7-year-olds help, mostly by asking questions and sampling anything within reach. She'd started, without anyone teaching her to, keeping her own small notebook of recipes, most of them involving some combination of chicken nuggets and excessive ketchup, and Marisol kept every page of it in a drawer at home rather than the trash, because some habits are worth encouraging before they've fully made sense yet. Desmond Ashcroft still ran his incognito week every November, though he told Marisol, on his one visit back to the restaurant that first winter, that the experiment felt different to him now than it had before he'd met her, less like an audit of what was wrong with the world, and more like a search for the next person willing to prove it wasn't only Pearl Higgins, and a handful of others who still believed in this particular, unglamorous form of kindness. "You planning on doing this every year forever?" Marisol asked him, refilling his coffee herself. "Until it stops working," he said. "So far, it's worked 4 times in 11 years. That's not a great average, but it's not 0 either. And when you find the 5th one, same as I found you. Quietly. No cameras, no headline. Some things work better when nobody's performing for an audience." Marisol thought about that for a moment, wiping down the counter beside him. "You know what I think, Desmond? I think the reason it works at all is that the people who pass your test aren't trying to pass anything. We're just people who can't walk past somebody without stopping. You can't manufacture that in somebody who doesn't already have it in them somewhere." "No," he agreed. "You can't. You can only go looking for it year after year and hope you find it before you run out of Novembers." Before he left that day, Marisol asked him, carefully, whether he'd ever found a way to properly honor Pearl Higgins, the woman who'd fed him for free all those years ago. Ashcroft told her about the small plaque he'd had installed at the site of the old diner off Route 9, long since replaced by a different business, and the scholarship he funded every year at the local community college in Pearl's name, for students working full-time jobs while trying to finish a degree nobody expected them to have the time for. "It's not the same as being able to thank her myself," he said, "but it's the closest I've found." "Maybe that's the corner stool's whole job too," Marisol said. "Not paying anybody back exactly, just paying it in the direction it's needed." He left a $100 bill under his coffee cup on his way out that day, the same as any other customer might, and Marisol found it after he'd gone, folded exactly the way she'd once folded a $20 bill into his hand outside a gas station. She kept it in the register drawer for a week before she finally understood it wasn't meant to be spent, and pinned it instead to the corkboard above the corner stool, where it's stayed ever since. Every November since, on the anniversary of that Tuesday at the gas station, Marisol closes the corner table for the evening and cooks a private dinner for whoever happens to be sitting at the corner stool that week. No charge, no explanation required, just a plate set down in front of a stranger having a hard month, the same way her grandmother once fed anyone who showed up at the back door. Camila, old enough now to understand most of the story, insists on helping carry the plates out herself, and insists, every year, that the story gets told again in full before dessert, as though repetition were the thing that kept it true. "You could have kept walking that night," Bianca told her once, watching her prepare one of these anniversary dinners. "Nobody would have blamed you. You had exactly 120 and a kid who needed medicine." "I know," Marisol said. "That's sort of the whole point, isn't it? Here's the thing worth sitting with. Long after the $20 bill and the doorstep conversation have faded from memory, Marisol Vega had every reasonable excuse available to her that Tuesday night to keep walking. She needed that $20 more than almost anyone who might have handed it over instead. She gave it away anyway, expecting nothing, wanting nothing, already halfway back to her car before the man could even finish thanking her. So here's the real question. Would you have stopped? Tell us honestly in the comments. And if this one stayed with you, subscribe to Karmaline Stories, because the next stranger who needs someone to stop might be closer than you think.